Hi, everyone. Welcome to Good Morning Sunshine Mindful Moment. This is an interview I have wanted to do for about a decade now, ever since I moved to Arizona. Today, we have the honor of having someone by the name of Dr. Sisley here in our studios today. Dr. Sisley has always been on the forward thinking of science. Back when it was very unpopular, when it was socially unacceptable, she was the nation's leading researcher back in 07, 08, when it came to cannabis and helping people heal from PTSD with cannabis. So, doctor, it's so good to have you on the show.
Thank you for the invite.
I love this. I love this. We're not going to actually be talking about cannabis per se today. I really want to talk about the power of psychedelics.
Yeah,
this is something that is going to get a lot of pushback, but that's why I love having you on the show. We're talking about things like microdosing shrooms, LSD, and other psychedelics in order to help someone heal from their trauma.
Yes.
I just got to ask you this first and foremost. How can psychedelics, how can a plant help any of us who have experienced childhood trauma, adult trauma, heal?
Yeah, I think what happens is the trauma gets deeply entrenched in the brain, and it's so hard to examine it once it's set in like that. So psychedelics help sort of break that open. Those structures of the brain that are grabbing onto these memories, it lets it come to the surface, the psychedelics, and it does that through creating new neural connections by promoting empathy, where people are able to feel trustful. Like if they have a therapist, maybe you've been through talk therapy for 10 years and never felt like you were progressing. Suddenly, the psychedelics give them the ability to feel connected to the therapist and trusting in a way where they can finally open the trauma, examine it, process it to a point where it's no longer threatening anymore. And so until that happens, you're left with, the trauma creates all these dark, unwanted thoughts that keep creeping into their daily life, and it's really hard to overcome that. And as you said, folks can be involved in decades of talk therapy and never be able to achieve any improvement.
And I think I'm a great example of that, to be quite honest with you. I had 12 years of continuous recovery in AA alone and talk therapy. But what's really important for people to understand is when you're in talk therapy, it's all frontal lobe.
Yes.
But the traumatic memories, all that trauma lives in the back part of our brain. The energy still lives within our bodies. And so even though I had 12 years of continuous recovery, doctor, I never healed from the trauma.
Yes.
So then when trauma hit me back in 2020, I got triggered and I relapsed.
Yes.
And it was after that relapse where I started shamanism. And that, and he uses psychedelics, but I do deep breath work, getting me past the frontal lobe to the lower part of my brain to reprocess a lot of that trauma. And essentially making people vulnerable,
Yes.
right? And for what you're saying, the psychedelics help us become more vulnerable so that when we are doing therapy, it allows us to reprocess some of that trauma.
That's it. That's the key, is just being able, because the problem is, especially with cumulative trauma, like what you're describing, somebody may have their index trauma, their first bad experience at a very young age, but then there's so many traumas that happen throughout our life that keep building on the original, and suddenly, and that's why part of our research is examining if we intervene earlier, like right after the trauma occurs, can we possibly help people, not just save them years of their life being wasted and dysfunctional, but also that it's maybe easier to treat trauma once, if you can tackle it early on before it's really set into the brain and just,
And I think one of the battles that, people like us, very forward thinking with the advancements of science and helping people heal trauma, is breaking through the stigma.
Yes.
Because the moment you talk about LSD, the moment you talk about shrooms or MDMA, people are always like, oh, these are party drugs, right? Because people have used those drugs in large quantities to party, right?
Exactly.
So I think the only way we break that stigma is through education.
Yes.
So first tell me, what is microdosing?
Right. Well, microdosing is these, it's the smaller doses that allow people to still be very high functioning in the day, but also still exert positive clinical benefits to people. Like, for instance, a lot of folks with psilocybin, if you take a large dose where you're able to actually trip and hallucinate, that can, put people out of commission for a day or so. Whereas with these smaller doses, they seem to enable people to have, some mood elevation, some improved focus, things like that, without having all the, total myriad of perceptual changes. So I think it's a really valuable technique that a lot of the military veterans we work with have taught me how they're using microdosing as a substitute to a lot of the really toxic prescriptions that they've been given by the VA system. A lot of them are tired of what they call this combat cocktail of being pummeled with all these different meds that have tons of side effects. They want just something natural, because that's part of what psychedelics do. They make people feel connected to nature. They feel a oneness with the universe. They start contemplating the cosmos and things like that. And those are, I think, things that are valuable and could help our society in general. Like we talked about the impact of this pandemic, the isolation that has been promoted by the pandemic has been really detrimental to people's mental health. And the psychedelics have seen a new renaissance during this pandemic period, where people are experimenting with different psychedelics to see if they can again regain that connectedness to people.
And I think it's important to know that we're not talking about people going to the beach and putting some shrooms on a piece of pizza and tripping out,
right,
for 24 hours or however long that shroom trip is going to last. What does that person feel when they do a microdose? Because you say that they start at a very small dose and you kind of increase it over time.
Yes.
What does that feel like for somebody who's never done shrooms to microdose or LSD?
Right. It's everybody's so unique, and it
Right.
depends. There's thousands of different varieties of psilocybin mushrooms, for instance. So everybody is using different things, and so it's hard to really predict. But the vast majority of people who choose to microdose say that it makes them feel a sense of calmness, a improved focus, attention on tasks, and it seems to not really generate euphoria as much as just lift the depression. If they're living with a chronic depression, they find microdosing tends to edge up their mood.
And you actually are approved by the DEA to grow your own now, right?
Yes, so we had to fight for years in federal court and Congress to try to get this approval, but ultimately the DEA did issue us our own manufacturing licenses right here in Arizona. A lot of people don't know that because we're pretty discreet about this, but we are growing heaps of psilocybin mushrooms and cannabis, all for the purpose of research. So what we're growing to try to learn how to formulate this material, how to standardize it into specific doses that people can use in trials. So it's been a lot of fun, because all these other years we've been doing this research, we've been forced to buy this study drug from the government. So typically, we'd have to buy this really low quality cannabis, or the mushrooms, you couldn't get whole mushrooms. You could only buy synthetic psilocybin, which is okay. I mean, psilocybin is performing pretty well in some studies, but the fact is that we want to do real world studies, right? We want to replicate what people are actually using in their daily lives, and that's not synthetic material. They're using whole plant, whole mushroom, and that's what we want to use in our trial.
Listen, it's so fascinating, and I'm so grateful you came on to talk about this. And if you want more information, honestly, just check out my podcast, Escaping Rock Bottom. You can download it. We go in depth for about 45 minutes about this conversation, even more so. I just think it's important to have people like you, Dr. Sisley, out there pushing the envelope of science, because we need a breakthrough. There's so much trauma out there, and just relying on pharmaceuticals to heal us from that trauma will never work.
Yes.
It'll never heal you. So I appreciate the work that you're doing, and even with a lot of people coming after you and attacking you over the years, you're still pushing through, and you're still continuing that research because you believe in it. So thank you so much for coming on. We really do appreciate it. And thank you for watching Mindful Moments right here on Good Morning Sunshine.